Xiaovenin slowly woke up from the deep darkness, as if she had never slept so deeply in her memory. The action of opening his eyes seemed a little difficult, and the golden and dazzling sunlight instantly occupied his field of vision, making him unable to help but close his eyes again, and wait until he got used to the brightness before opening them again. This time he clearly saw himself lying in the middle of a snow-white room, with a white ceiling above his head and a rectangular white ceiling light in the middle. Although the light was on, it came in from the window. The sun is obviously more dazzling. The sun is white gold, unlike the morning sun that always brings vibrant oranges, it feels more like a hot afternoon. Xiaovenin didn't know if it was as hot as it looked outside, at least the air conditioner was on in the room, and the temperature was just right, so that his body under the thin quilt was neither cold nor hot. But as soon as he tried to move, he found that his whole body was extremely stiff, and what followed was the first burst of throbbing pain. He couldn't help but let out a soft hum. "Are you awake?" A deep male voice suddenly came from the room, with an undisguised surprise in his tone. Xiaovenin wanted to look up to see where the person who was speaking was, but gave up after a little effort. He thought that he probably had an injury on his head, and it hurt so much when he moved. Dumb footsteps sounded in the room, stopping from the right corner to Xiaovenin's bedside. Xiaovenin also clearly saw the person who was talking just now, an unfamiliar male Alpha. Alpha looked in her mid-30s, wearing a slim-fitting black suit, her knuckle-length short hair pulled up, with only a few strands hanging down uncomfortably at the temples. Like most male alphas, he has a sharp and angular outline, but he is even more handsome. The corners of his eyebrows are slanted, his lips are shallow and thin, and he has a pair of beautiful eyes. Deep emotions. At this time, he bent down slightly, stared straight at Xiaovenin with those beautiful eyes, and asked, "How do you feel?" Xiaovenin frowned, looked at the strange Alpha in front of him, and asked, "Who are you?" Alpha couldn't hide the surprised look on his face. He looked at Xiaovenin for a moment, got up and rang the bell on the head of the bed, and said to the other side, "The patient is awake." Ended the call, Alpha stood by the bed and looked at Xiaovenin silently, until Xiaovenin wanted to get up but showed a painful expression because of the wound. He reached out and pressed Xiaovenin's chest, "Don't stand up." Xiaovenin took a breath and asked him, "This is the hospital? What happened to me?" Alpha did not answer immediately. Before Xiaovenin got the answer, the door of the ward was opened, and a group of 3 or 4 medical staff hurried in from outside. The one at the front was a middle-aged male doctor. When he entered the door, Xiaovenin clearly heard him call Mr. Ming. "Who is Mr. Ming? Is that the Alpha in the room?" Although Xiaovenin was suffering from a headache, he couldn't help but think curiously. The doctor and nurse soon surrounded him to examine him, and the Alpha by the bed retreated silently to the corner. Even when the doctor asked him what day of the month it was today, his mind was blurred. The middle-aged doctor frowned. Fortunately, he remembered that his name was Xiaovenin, a college student. College student? Everyone at the bedside paused, including the nurse who was measuring his blood pressure. The middle-aged doctor looked back at Alpha standing in the corner. Alpha had no expression on his face, just looked at Xiaovenin. The doctor asked Xiaovenin, "Do you remember who that gentleman is?" He pointed to Alpha in the corner. Xiaovenin knew who he was referring to, so he shook his head without looking over, and his eyes kept falling on the other young male doctor beside the hospital bed. The middle-aged doctor followed his line of sight and asked, "What's wrong?" Xiaovenin showed a puzzled expression and said to the young doctor, "You look like a middle school classmate of mine." The young doctor smiled awkwardly and did not speak, only the middle-aged doctor said, "Really?" Xiaovenin thought it was very strange. He carefully looked at the man's eyebrows and nodded, "It's really similar, but he's a little older." The young doctor still smiled unnaturally and said, "I should be your classmate." Xiaovenin said, "Oh. You are Lin Shuqiu." Lin Shuqiu did not speak. It seemed that he did not intend to continue the conversation with Xiaovenin. Xiaovenin had to lie down in silence, and continued to cooperate with the inspection in confusion. After half an hour, the doctors and nurses in the ward left one after another. Before the middle-aged doctor left, he invited the alpha in the room to go out with him, leaving Xiaovenin alone. He was a little tired, closed his eyes and slept for a short sleep, and when he woke up, he saw that the alpha had returned, leaning on the chair beside the bed, clasped his hands on the knees were looking at him. Seeing Xiaovenin wake up, he didn't move, just asked, "Are you okay?" Alpha looked at Xiaovenin for a long time and said, "You don't remember me?" Xiaovenin wondered, "We know each other." Alpha's tone of voice was a little cold, "My name is Ming Luchuan, and I'm your husband." "My what?" Xiaovenin's head was blank for a moment. The alpha named Ming Luchuan repeated, "Your husband." Xiaovenin continued to maintain a blank thinking for a long time, waiting for the moment of recovery. He only felt chills all over his body. He turned his eyes away, reached out to pull the thin quilt on his body, and slowly being pulled over his head, he said in a stiff and pale tone, "Did you recognize the wrong person?" When the quilt was about to completely cover his head, Ming Luchuan took his hand down. Ming Luchuan's palm was warm. He grabbed Xiaovenin's hand, slowly and forcefully stuffed it back under the quilt, and said, "You are in fusion." Xiaovenin suddenly felt a slight pain on the back of his hand. He pulled the quilt covering half of his face with his other hand, lay quietly for a while, and asked, "Are we? Is there any misunderstanding?" Ming Luchuan did not speak. "A little gloomy, and it doesn't look like it's easy to get along with." The ward was quiet for a while. Xiaovenin whispered, "I'm Beta." Ming Luchuan suddenly stood up and strode out of the ward. It wasn't until she heard the sound of the door of the ward closing that Xiaovenin stared at the ceiling and breathed a sigh of relief. Xiaovenin is a Beta. He remembers himself as a sophomore student, not yet 20 this year. But his memory is a little fuzzy. Yesterday's events don't seem like yesterday's events, but seem to have happened in the distant past. He thought that there should be a gap in his memory, but something inexplicable happened in this gap, which would cause him to wake up in a hospital ward with a male alpha who claimed to be his husband. Thinking is still muddled, Xiaovenin slept again after Ming Luchuan left, and when he woke up again, the light in the ward became dim, and it was completely dark outside the window. There are people standing beside the hospital bed. A young female nurse is packing the infusion bottle, the other is Lin Shukyu, holding a stethoscope in his hand is pressing on Xiaovenin's chest. He bent down to face Xiaovenin, slowly opening his eyes. He looked a little embarrassed for a while. Xiaovenin said, "Lin Shukyu." Lin Shukyu nodded, retracted the stethoscope and stood up straight. The female nurse pushed the card away, and before leaving, said to Lin Shukyu, "Dr. Lin, I'm going out first." Lin Shukyu nodded, but she stood by the hospital bed and did not move. When there were only 2 people left in the ward, Xiaovenin said, "Are you really Lin Shukyu?" "Of course." Lin Shukyu is a classmate of Xiaovenin High School, and like Xiaovenin is a Beta. Looking up to listen to the teacher's lecture, and always dodging eyes when looking at people. Now Lin Shukyu is still thin and delicate, but the glasses on her face are gone. She no longer hides when looking at people, adding a lot of adult calmness. Lin Shukyu stood beside the hospital bed, with the stethoscope hanging in the pocket of his white coat, and said to Xiaovenin, "You have memory impairment caused by traumatic brain injury." Xiaovenin had already guessed it, and he asked, "Will I restore my memory?" "Possibly." "How did I get injured?" Xiaovenin had a lot of questions and wanted to ask the doctor this afternoon, but the middle-aged doctor did not answer him. Now there are only the 2 of them left in the ward. Lin Shukyu did not avoid Xiaovenin any longer, saying, "You have a car accident." Xiaovenin raised his hand, wanting to touch his head, but was blocked by Lin Shukyu. "I seem to have been in a coma for a long time." "You were in a coma for 3 days." 3 days? Xiaovenin was a little stunned. "I don't remember many things, and you look many years older." Lin Shukyu thought for a while. "You said that you are a sophomore this year, then you have lost nearly 6 years of memory. 6 years. Xiaovenin widened his eyes. I remember we were the same year, we are both 26 years old this year. Xiaovenin worked hard to digest the information. He thought of Ming Luchuan, and said, that alpha, that afternoon. Mr. Ming. Lin Shuqiu said, you don't remember him either, he is your husband. Xiaovenin once again heard this unacceptable news. He was very puzzled. Why should I marry a male alpha? Hey! Lin Shuqiu was obviously unable to answer this question, with a blank expression on his face. I don't know. The nurse came over and knocked on the door, telling Lin Shuqiu that a patient was looking for a doctor. Lin Shuqiu hurriedly said to Xiaovenin, I'm still on duty, I'll talk to you when I have time. After that, he left with the nurse. The room fell into a soft darkness. Xiaovenin closed his eyes, lying on the bed thinking of Ming Luchuan. He was disturbed, and always felt that this matter should not be so simple. Did not see Ming Luchuan the next morning. The nurse pushed a wheelchair into the ward and picked up Xiaovenin for examination. Xiaovenin is still very weak and needs someone to help him out of bed, but his condition is better than yesterday. Before leaving for the examination, he wanted to go to the bathroom. The nurse helped him to the door and wanted to help him in, but he firmly refused. The lights in the bathroom were dim, and Xiaovenin had to use the aids inside to barely stand still. He grabbed the metal armrest firmly, stood in front of the mirror, and looked at the familiar and unfamiliar young beta in the glass mirror. It's still the same face, but the hair is long, the person is thinner, and it's even a little whiter than I remember, because it looks a little weak because of the injury. And more importantly, Xiaovenin could see the slight changes in the facial features, just like Lin Shuqiu told him yesterday. He is no longer a college student in the mirror, but a 26-year-old young man. He lost 6 years of his life inexplicably, and inexplicably gained an alpha husband. After 2 inspections in the morning, Xiaovenin has been absent-minded. After the nurse sent him back to the hospital bed, he lay lazily on the bed, staring at the white ceiling in a daze. Until noon the hospital nurse came to deliver the meal. Ming Luchuan also came. Ming Luchuan was wearing a dark grey suit without a tie, and the collar of his shirt was open unruly. Xiaovenin looked up at him when he entered the door, and saw that his face was cold and expressionless. Ming Luchuan has not spoken since entering the ward. He went straight to the bedside and pressed the control button beside the bed to raise the head of Xiaovenin's bed. Xiaovenin leaned on the bed, then watched Ming Luchuan sit down beside the bed, and opened the lunch box that the nurse sent just now. That's my meal, Xiaovenin thought to himself, but couldn't say the words. Ming Luchuan held a spoon in his hand and lowered his eyes to the lunch box. Xiaovenin was in a coma for a few days. His diet today was still porridge and soft-boiled meat and vegetables. Ming Luchuan scooped a spoonful of porridge with a spoon. He leaned against the lunch box to cool down for a while, then lifted it up and handed it to Xiaovenin. Mouth. Xiaovenin was stunned for a moment and asked, "Are you feeding me?" Ming Luchuan didn't answer, just put the porridge directly into his mouth when he opened his mouth to speak. Xiaovenin was caught off guard, so he could only swallow it hastily in his mouth, and suddenly got a little annoyed and said, "Are you feeding pigs?" Ming Luchuan glanced at him this time and said, "Yes." In this way, Ming Luchuan fed Xiaovenin spoon by spoon to finish his lunch, and then picked up another lunch box and sat down beside the sofa to eat slowly. Xiaovenin sat on the bed after eating. He couldn't help staring at Ming Luchuan, and when Ming Luchuan raised his head, he turned his eyes away pretending not to care. When Ming Luchuan finished eating and packed the lunch box in front of him, Xiaovenin asked, "We are really married?" Ming Luchuan looked up at him with an indescribably cold expression. Xiaovenin was uncomfortable and asked, "How long has it been?" Ming Luchuan said coldly, "Half a year." Xiaovenin had a lot of questions, but he couldn't ask Ming Luchuan's eyes, and finally picked one that seemed to be relatively insignificant at the moment. "Where does my grandfather live now?" Ming Luchuan did not answer immediately this time, but said after a brief silence, "He died." The air in the ward seemed to freeze. After saying that, Ming Lichuan's expression was no longer cold, and he sat on the sofa with a straight back and looked at Xia Venan. Xia Venan couldn't react for a while and said, "You lied to me." Ming Lichuan said, "Why should I lie to you? No one will use this kind of thing to deceive people." After subconsciously refuting, Xia Venan quickly understood. He curled up his legs, lowered his head and rested his forehead on his knees. The bad news came without warning and caught him off guard. It took a while for the sadness to cover up his shock. Shy. Xia Venan wanted to lift the quilt and get out of bed, and went back to see with his own eyes whether his grandfather was still there, but before that, he couldn't help crying. He didn't cry, he buried his head and didn't want to be seen by Ming Lichuan. But Ming Lichuan didn't know when he had walked to the bedside, raised his hand and pressed it lightly on his back. Alpha, whose expression was always indifferent, was warm and stuck to Xia Venan's vest through the thin hospital gown. Xia Venan was not in the mood to dodge at this time. He opened his eyes, and all he thought of was Grandpa. He worked outside during the winter vacation of his sophomore year, and didn't go home until it was almost New Year's Eve. At that time, I always felt that my grandfather was there, and I could see him as long as I went back. I didn't expect to wake up in a car accident and hear such news. Ming Lichuan's palm fell in the air, looked at Xia Venan for a while, and retracted his hand in silence. In order to ease the embarrassment, Xia Venan said, "Thank you, I'm fine." Ming Lichuan turned around and walked towards the door. He stretched out his hand to pick up the suit jacket that was placed on the back of the sofa during dinner, and said coldly, "There is something in the company, I'll go first." Xia Venan said, "Oh." When he saw Ming Lichuan open the door and was about to go out, he remembered another thing and hurriedly shouted, "Hello." Ming Lichuan stopped, and when he looked back at him, his jaw lifted slightly, and there was not much expression on his face. Xia Venan could only ask carefully, "Have you seen my cell phone?" Ming Lichuan said, "It broke." "Broke in?" "It broke in a car accident." After saying this, Ming Lichuan waited for a few seconds with his hand on the door handle, and then left the ward when he saw that Xia Venan had nothing else to say. In the afternoon, Lin Shuqiu came to Xia Venan's ward and sat with him for a while. Xia Venan was not in a good mood. He listened to Lin Shuqiu talking about his condition, and suddenly asked, "Do you know my grandfather's condition?" Xia Venan has no parents and was raised by his grandfather since childhood. Most of their high school classmates know about this. However, too many years have passed, and Lin Shuqiu couldn't help being stunned when he heard Xia Venan's words, and said, "I don't know, we lost contact after high school, and I only saw you this time when you were admitted to the hospital. Am I in a car accident?" Lin Shuqiu nodded. "Do I drive myself?" Lin Shuqiu thought for a while, "It seems so, I don't know the specific situation. Anyone else in the car?" This time Lin Shuqiu shook his head, "I don't know." "Why didn't you ask Mr. Ming?" Xia Venan remembered Ming Lichuan's cold face and said, "I think he is a bit fierce." Lin Shuqiu was silent for a while, and said in agreement, "He is a bit fierce." Xia Venan raised his hand to scratch his hair, but almost hit the wound on his head. He suddenly retracted his hand and said, "No, I have to go back." Lin Shuqiu stood up, "You can't leave the hospital yet." Xia Venan looked up at him, "I want to know about my grandpa." "What news?" Lin Shuqiu had already reached the bedside, blocking Xia Venan's leg that had already stepped out of the bed. Xia Venan looked up at him and said, "Ming Lichuan said my grandfather died." Lin Shuqiu was stunned for a moment. Xia Venan looked a little dazed, "I can't find my mobile phone, and I don't know who I can contact to ask about my grandpa." "I'll help you find out," Lin Shuqiu said, "Don't worry, I'll let you know as soon as I have news." Lin Shuqiu went out of the ward to make a phone call. Before leaving get off work in the afternoon, he brought the confirmed news of Grandpa Xia Venan's death. Xia Venan sat on the hospital bed in a daze. Lin Shuqiu comforted him, congratulations. Xiaovenin nodded, actually, I just didn't give up. I already knew the result, but it still took a little luck. So far, Xiaovenin can only give up completely. He was in a very downhearted mood. The nurse sent dinner to the ward. He glanced at him and didn't move. When he was alone in the room, he slowly got out of bed and walked to the window. The evening sun is still dazzling, penetrating the glass window and falling on the floor of the room, but this dazzling sunlight is quickly dimmed, and the angle is gradually tilted, until the last trace of dark red from Xiaovenin disappeared in front of. The sky turned a deep grey blue, with only a hint of red remaining in the distant horizon, which would soon disappear completely. Downstairs is a small garden, small but full of colorful flowers. After the sun had withdrawn, orange lights were lit up in the garden, giving the cold hospital a quiet warmth. Xiaovenin heard the sound of the door of the ward opening. He did not look back, but leaned forward slightly against the window to support his weak body. The footsteps were soft, and they stopped behind him. Xiaovenin probably guessed who it was, but didn't want to speak, and still stood by the window dully. After about 10 minutes, Ming Lichuan said behind him, "It's time to rest." His tone was as stiff and indifferent as ever. Ming Lichuan doesn't seem to want to leave tonight. Xiaovenin was lying on the hospital bed with his arms behind his head, and saw Ming Lichuan go into the bathroom to wash. After a while, Ming Lichuan came out, changed into a set of pajamas, opened the door of a standing cabinet next to him, and pulled out a folding bed from inside. The position of the bed is parallel to Xiaovenin's bed. Ming Lichuan sat down beside the bed, facing Xiaovenin, who was half lying on the bed looking at him. Xiaovenin turned his eyes away and looked forward, but after a while, he could still feel Ming Lichuan's gaze falling on him. So after waiting for a while, Xiaovenin turned back to look at Ming Lichuan and said, "What are you looking at me for?" The expression on Ming Lichuan's face was motionless. He didn't even lift his eyelids, and said, "Then what should I do? It seems like a long time has passed, and the lights in the room have been turned off, leaving only a small night light." Xiaovenin heard the sound of shaking from the bed next to him. Ming Lichuan probably lay down and fell asleep, and at the same time he heard Ming Lichuan seem to say, "Then you care who I see." Xiaovenin turned his back to Ming Lichuan, thinking that this alpha is really difficult to get along with. The sleep was over, and Xiaovenin was awakened by the voice of the door of the ward the next morning. He opened his eyes and raised his head slightly, only to see Ming Lichuan's tall back in a white shirt. Ming Lichuan was talking to someone. After a while, he turned to his side. Xiaovenin first saw a large bouquet of beautiful flowers, and then saw a young man whose upper body was almost covered by flowers. It was a strange male Omega. Venin, Omega gave Xiaovenin a gentle smile, walked to the window holding the flowers, and placed the bunch of flowers gently on the windowsill. Omega then walked to the bedside and looked down at Xiaovenin. He has a very light pheromone scent on his body, a very fresh herbal scent, which can only be smelled when he is very close, without the slightest aggression. "How are you feeling?" Omega asked. Xiaovenin glanced at him, then looked at Ming Lichuan standing behind him, and said, "It's okay." Omega looked at Xiaovenin's expression, and asked strangely after a while, "What's wrong with you? Is there something wrong with you?" Ming Lichuan said at this time, he lost his memory. Amnesia. Omega's eyes widened in surprise. Xiaovenin found that his eyes were somewhat similar to Ming Lichuan. Omega maintained a surprised look on his face. "How can I lose my memory?" "Because of a car accident." "It was caused by trauma," Ming Lichuan replied calmly. "Then you don't recognize me?" Omega said, "I'm Ming Xian." Xiaovenin shook his head slowly. He had just woken up not long ago. He couldn't help but cough to clear his throat, reached out to find the button beside the bed and wanted to sit up. The Omega named Ming Xian reached out to stop him. "You fall asleep, don't get up." Xiaovenin fumbled for a while on the edge of the metal bed but couldn't find the button, so he gave up. He said, I can't remember anyone. After speaking, he felt that this sentence might cause misunderstanding. He added, the memory has been interrupted since the sophomore year. Ming Xian was obviously a little overwhelmed. He looked at Xia Venan for a while, then looked back at Ming Luchuan and asked, Brother, what did the doctor say? Ming Luchuan said solemnly, the doctor said that he must first determine his recovery from the traumatic brain injury. If the traumatic brain injury has healed, the treatment of the remaining memory impairment will be a slow and long-term process. Ming Xian looked worried and asked cautiously, will it recover? Ming Luchuan was silent for a while, then said, no exclusion. Ming Xian sighed and looked at Xia Venan. Xia Venan was stunned. He had also heard Lin Shuqiu talk about his condition before. Lin Shuqiu had a more positive attitude, believing that his memory could be restored through medication and rehabilitation. This was the first time for him I heard someone say that his memory may not be restored. At that moment, Xia Venan did not have an urgent desire to restore his memory. His memory is still in his second year of sophomore year. 20-year-old youth is probably the best time in his life. He doesn't know what he has experienced in the next 6 years, why he got married so early, and why he married an alpha. At the age of 20, it was unimaginable and afraid to face it. But these things are not something you can't face without thinking about it. Life is a one-way street, and there is no turning back once you have gone down. It is impossible for him to go back to university, and he has no grandfather, so even if he is unwilling, he must face and take on the responsibility for the rest of his life. He was just dazed and at a loss, not knowing what would happen if he recovered his memory, and how he would survive if he could never recover his memory. Ming Xian greeted him a few words from the bedside. He answered casually and didn't even know what Ming Xian was asking. Ming Xian frowned slightly. He has a pair of eyes similar to Ming Luchuan, but his face and facial features are clearly Omega's beautiful, like a warm and moist porcelain with transparent glaze. He stood for a while and said, Venan needs a rest, so I'll go first. Ming Luchuan stood beside him and did not speak. Ming Xian turned her head and said to Ming Luchuan, Dad was going to come, but he caught a cold last night, and he was afraid that it would not be appropriate to visit the hospital. Ming Luchuan's eyelashes drooped slightly and nodded. Ming Xian said to Xia Venan again, Venan, rest well, Dad will come to see you in a few days. Xia Venan doesn't know the father he talks about. But Xia Venan's own father has been dead for more than 20 years. The father Ming Xian said can never be his father, but Ming Luchuan's father. He was in a mess, and he didn't want to socialize with Ming Xian, so he just nodded. Ming Xian turned and left the ward. The moment he turned around, Xia Venan noticed that there was a tattoo on the back of his neck, which was a colorful butterfly, where the gland was. Ming Luchuan walked over to open the door for him. Ming Xian stood at the door of the ward, and said a few words to Ming Luchuan before leaving. Xia Venan lay on the bed and stretched out his hand to explore carefully. This time, he finally found the lift button and raised the bed halfway. His body was lifted up, leaning back and looking at Ming Luchuan. Ming Luchuan came back to the bed and reached out to lift his quilt. Xia Venan was startled, grabbed Ming Luchuan's hand, and asked, What are you doing? Ming Luchuan's tone was slightly impatient, Aren't you going to get up? Xia Venan hurriedly said, I will get up by myself. Ming Luchuan shook off his hand, As you like. In the morning, Xia Venan did 2 more checks. Ming Luchuan didn't leave today and stayed with him in the hospital. After the examination, Xia Venan followed Ming Luchuan to the doctor's office and saw the middle-aged doctor who examined him when he woke up that day. The doctor took the pictures and medical records of his imaging examination and explained Xia Venan's current condition. Xia Venan suffered a closed craniocerebral injury caused by a car accident. He was admitted to the hospital and had slight bleeding. After a few days of treatment, it was completely absorbed and he is currently recovering well. However, his memory impairment is considered to be post-traumatic brain injury syndrome, which requires a long recovery process. Xia Venan was really uncomfortable in the hospital. He asked the doctor, "When can I be discharged?" The doctor replied, "You are recovering well from your trauma, and you are ready to be discharged now." Xia Venan glanced at Ming Gluquan subconsciously. Ming Luchuan leaned back slightly on the back of the chair with a gloomy expression, and said, "But he can't remember anything." The doctor put his hands on the tabletop of the desk, sighed lightly, and said, "Mr. Ming, even if Mr. Xia continues to be hospitalized, there is no way we can guarantee the recovery of his memory." "Is there no way to recover in the future?" The doctor said, "It may take a process, and if it goes well, it may be able to recover within 3 months. No one asked what would happen if it didn't go well. Ming Luchuan's face was very ugly. Xia Venan said at this time, "I want to be discharged from the hospital." The doctor turned to Xia Venan, "Mr. Xia, even if you are discharged from the hospital, you still have to come back for regular checkups, and take medicines while taking a course of rehabilitation therapy." Xia Venan nodded. The doctor said, "That's it, I'll let them make arrangements for you today and prepare to be discharged from the hospital tomorrow." After speaking, he looked at Ming Luchuan and waited for his opinion. The corners of Ming Luchuan's mouth tightened, and after a while he raised his eyes and said, "Okay." That night, Ming Luchuan stayed in the hospital overnight. I don't know if it was because he was going to be discharged from the hospital tomorrow. Xia Venan was a little excited but couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned on the bed, and he was still awake until late at night, so he simply lifted the quilt and got out of bed gently. He stepped on the slippers and just left the bed when he heard Ming Luchuan's dull voice in the quiet room, "Where to go?" Xia Venan was startled, stopped and turned around, "I can't sleep." He wanted to go out for a walk. At this time, the corridor outside was still lit, and the nurse station was also lit. There are also night shift nurses. The silhouette of Ming Luchuan sat at the table in the dark, as if looking at him. "Where to go?" Xia Venan said, "Just outside in the corridor." Ming Luchuan stood up and approached him, "Let's go." Xia Venan looked at him hard, but still couldn't see the expression on his face, so he could only ask, "Are you going to?" Ming Luchuan didn't answer, standing by and waiting for Xia Venan, as if the meaning was clearly expressed. Xia Venan suddenly changed his mind, "Forget it, then I'll take a walk in the room." After a while, he noticed Ming Luchuan standing beside him. The night wind brought the aroma of flowers and plants in from outside the window, and at the same time, the air was mixed with other smells. It is a kind of cold woody aroma. It is not easy to describe the smell of a certain kind of tree, but it is somewhat like a forest in a deep mountain. Looking up, there are straight and towering ancient trees everywhere, and the solace of the feet are cool and clean mountain springs. In the depths of the woods, the outline of the ancient temple with blue tiles and white walls is looming. This is completely inconsistent with the Xia environment of the hospital where Xia Venan is now, and makes him feel a little calmer. After the calm, Xia Venan suddenly realized that the cold woody fragrance was the pheromone flavor of Ming Gluquan. He has been with Ming Gluquan for so long since he woke up from a coma, and this is the first time he has smelled the pheromones of Ming Gluquan. He then took a step back and distanced himself from Ming Luchuan. The moonlight came in from the window and fell on Ming Luchuan's face. The bridge of his nose left a shadow on the side of his face. There was no superfluous expression on his face, only the thick eyelashes seemed to hang down tiredly. Said, "What are you hiding?" Xia Venan hesitated and said, "I smell your pheromone." Although Alpha is in a calm state, the pheromone released is still aggressive to other gender groups. It is not a polite behavior to release pheromone at will. In the air, the pheromone of Ming Gluquan was neither light nor heavy, or it was still floating in midair. He looked at Xia Venan and asked, "Does it smell bad?" Xia Venan thought for a while and answered him, "Actually, it's okay, but it's not suitable." After that, he added, "Don't think I'm a beta, but I'm very sensitive to smells." Ming Luchuan said, "I know. The pheromone smell is gone." Xia Venan breathed a sigh of relief. At this moment, he felt that Ming Luchuan should not be a very unreasonable person, so he asked a question that has always been inconvenient to ask: why do we get married? Ming Luchuan looked out the window and repeated in a low voice, why? Xia Venan said, yes, I don't quite understand why I choose to marry you. After speaking, he immediately realized that what he said was inappropriate, and quickly added, I don't think that you're not good, it's just that alpha has never been my sexual orientation. Especially the male alpha, he silently added a sentence in his heart. Ming Luchuan still didn't look at him, his expression was a little serious, and after a while he said, then I don't know. What? Xia Venan didn't understand what he meant. Ming Luchuan said, you proposed to me. What? This time Xia Venan expressed an unbelievable meaning. Ming Luchuan raised one hand and gently placed it on the windowsill, with his palm facing down and his fingers slightly curved. You say you like me, you must be with me. There was no joke in his tone, but too serious. Xia Venan subconsciously retorted, how is it possible? If it wasn't for me, or you were daydreaming. Ming Luchuan turned to look at him, and his eyes became gloomy again. Do you believe it? You think I'm a chicken? Ming Luchuan's tone was very bad. Xia Venan said, I don't understand the metaphor. Just like my sexuality is not a chicken, my sexuality will not be a male alpha. Ming Luchuan took a step towards him, I'm not a chicken. I didn't say you were a chicken. After Xia Venan finished saying this, he suddenly smelled the fragrance of Ming Luchuan pheromone in the dry air, and he said no to what he wanted to say next. After exiting, I couldn't help but take 2 steps back to maintain a distance from Ming Luchuan. Xia Venan took 2 steps back to the hospital bed, he sat on the edge of the hospital bed, looked up at Ming Luchuan, and said nervously, although I am not an Omega, I am also protected by the law, you can't mess around just because you're an Alpha. Ming Luchuan said, we are legal partners. Xia Venan immediately said, who knows if it's really legal? Ming Luchuan did not speak with a cold face. Said in a very sincere tone. Ming Luchuan did not speak. Xia Venan continued, it's getting late, rest. After speaking, he deliberately showed a pleasing smile. Ming Luchuan stared at him for a while, then turned and walked towards the escort's movable bed. Xia Venan secretly breathed a sigh of relief, quickly lay down, and pulled the quilt up until half of his face was covered. Ming Luchuan lay back on his bed without saying a word. Xia Venan felt that he was probably making Ming Luchuan angry, so he wanted to say a few words to ease the atmosphere. He turned around and glanced at Ming Luchuan, and by the dim light in the room, all I could see was the bulging figure on the bed next to me. After hesitating for a moment, Xia Venan gave up. He closed his eyes quietly, fatigue gradually struck, and finally fell asleep. College boys can have too many troubles, even if they sleep, they will pass. The next morning, the director led the doctor to round the room and asked Lin Shukyu to discharge Xia Venan from the hospital. The discharge procedures were handled by Ming Luchuan. Xia Venan was waiting in the ward. He wanted to pack his luggage and found that there was not much to pack. Before Ming Luchuan came back to the ward, a young male beta came in first. He was wearing a suit and glasses. Serious look. Xia Venan stared at him blankly. He was silent for a while, then said, Mr. Xia, I'm Mr. Ming's assistant, my name is Su Feng. Xia Venan nodded, hello. Su Feng said, I'm here to pick you up. When he finished speaking, Ming Luchuan appeared at the open door of the ward and said, let's go. Xia Venan stood up from the bed, took a last look at the ward that had been living since waking up from a coma, and followed Ming Luchuan and the others with a sigh. A black Maybach was parked in the parking lot in front of the hospital building. Su Feng carried Xia Venan's small suitcase and put it in the trunk of the car. Xia Venan stopped in front of the car. A strange idea. Ming Luchuan was already in the back seat at this time. He looked at Xia Venan from the open car door, and urged impatiently, get in the car. Xia Venan asked him, is this my car or your car? Su Feng passed by Xia Venan and was going to the co-pilot seat when he heard this question and looked up at Xia Venan, but did not speak. Ming Luchuan asked, is there a difference? Ming Luchuan replied, it's the company's car. Xia Venan bent down and asked Ming Luchuan, what company? This time Su Feng couldn't help but said, Mr. Ming's company Minjian. Oh, Xia Venan's little spark went out, and he said in no spirit, then I won't get in the car. Where are you going? Ming Luchuan's expression instantly turned cold. Xia Venan put one hand on the edge of the car door, I'm going to see my grandpa. You think I'm lying to you? Xia Venan's face was gloomy, whether you lied to me or not, I have to go back, I have already. He originally wanted to say that he hadn't gone back for several months, but then he realized that the time was far more than that. In a few months, the separation between him and his grandfather may be forever, and the uncontrollable sadness welled up. He didn't want to shed tears, so he stood up straight and said, anyway, I'm going back right now, can you give me back my ID? Xia Venan will have to use his ID card until Ming Luchuan will discharge him from the hospital. Ming Luchuan was still sitting in the back seat of the car and didn't move, just looked up at him, how are you going to get back? Xia Venan had neither money nor a mobile phone at this time. He nodded and said in a natural tone, how about you lend me some more money? After he finished speaking, Ming Luchuan looked at him and said nothing. Su Feng and the driver in the front row of the car also remained silent. Xia Venan said, I will pay it back. You are so stingy even in a luxury car. Ming Luchuan exhaled slowly, as if full of emotion, he paused for a few seconds, and said to the people in the front row, get out of the car. Su Feng and the driver looked at each other, without asking why, they just opened the door and got out of the car. Ming Luchuan stepped out of the car door with his long legs, stood in front of Xia Venan, and said blankly, I'll take you there. Xia Venan got into the co-pilot, he peeked at Ming Luchuan, and saw Ming Luchuan sitting upright in the driver's seat, driving out of the hospital. Thank you, Xia Venan thought for a while and decided to thank Ming Luchuan. Ming Luchuan did not speak or look at him. The car is on its way out of town. Xia Venan is studying in this city, and his hometown is in the county seat, which is about 40 kilometers away from the city. He has been studying and living here for nearly 2 years, mostly at school, and he is not very familiar with the city. But he is familiar with the road out of the city. When he first went to college, he was always worried about his grandfather who stayed at home alone. Every weekend, he had to take the subway first, and then transfer to the bus to go home. After a long time, he seemed to get used to it gradually, and felt that his grandfather should also get used to it, so he didn't go home so often, but began to enjoy his university life. Even so, he thought this road should not be what it is now. How many years? Oh, 6 years. How can there be such a big change from a person to a city in only 6 years? After leaving the city, the road becomes clear. There is a section of intercity expressway in front. After getting off the expressway, turn left to lead to the county seat. But Ming Luchuan turned to the right after driving off the expressway. Xia Venan immediately sat up straight and said, the direction is wrong. Ming Luchuan stopped the car at the intersection waiting for the red light and glanced at him. Xia Venan raised his hand and pointed to the left, turn that way. Ming Luchuan asked, where are you going? Go home. Xia Venan felt that his question was a bit baffling, didn't he know it? Ming Luchuan said, don't look at your grandfather. Xia Venan was stunned for a moment, and in the next instant he realized that to the left is the cemetery near the county seat. At that time, the death of grandfather became an unprecedented reality in front of Xia Venan's eyes. His entire face instantly lost the color of blood, and his lips were slightly opened and he did not speak. Ming Luchuan wanted to say something, but when he saw his expression, he silently closed his mouth and made a decision for him. The Qingming festival has passed, and there are not many people in the cemetery in the afternoon. The car was parked in the parking lot, and when Xia Venan got off the car, he was confused and didn't know where to go. Ming Luchuan locked the car door and walked towards the side of the cemetery gate. Xia Venan followed him in a daze, like a child who couldn't find a home. He followed Ming Luchuan to the door of a store and saw Ming Luchuan pick up a large bunch of flowers, and then he suddenly realized that Ming Luchuan came to buy flowers for his grandfather. The big bouquet of yellow and white flowers, Ming Luchuan picked it up and handed it to Xia Venan before asking the owner for the price. Xia Venan held the flowers, watched Ming Luchuan pay the bill, and said after a while, "Thank you." Ming Luchuan said nothing, turned and walked inside. Xia Venan could only continue to follow behind him. It was obviously not the first time for Ming Luchuan to come here. He walked into a small passage up the mountain familiarly, and his black leather shoes made a da-da sound when he stepped on the stone steps. Xia Venan asked Ming Luchuan, "Have you been here before?" "Yes," Ming Luchuan replied succinctly and indifferently. Xia Venan asked, "What are you doing here? Have you seen my grandpa before?" "Have seen." Xia Venan hesitated for a while, but continued to ask, "What do you do when you see him?" Ming Luchuan replied, "I don't need to see your family when you propose to me." Xia Venan firmly denied that he would propose to Ming Luchuan, so Ming Luchuan's words must be unreliable for him, which made him suddenly lose the desire to ask. And soon, he stood in front of a tombstone, and he was no longer in the mood to ask. The name and photo on the tombstone are indeed his grandfather, and not only his grandfather, this is a joint tomb. Among the ashes stored in the tomb were Grandpa Omega, who raised him, and Grandpa Beta, who he had never met. His grandfather was an Omega, and his family had already arranged a marriage for him, and his fiancée was an Alpha, but his grandfather fell in love with a Beta youth, so he ran away from the marriage. This little pride seems to dispel the misfortunes in his life, although his Beta husband died early, and his only son and daughter-in-law died in a car accident while traveling, at least he still has a well-behaved grandson. It can make him a little proud to tell his grandson about his elopement experience back then. Even if life is very hard, he never regrets it, because it was his own choice. He is a brave and amazing Omega. Xia Venan bent his knees, as if he could not support his body, and knelt down in front of the tombstone. He didn't cry bitterly while holding the tombstone, but just lowered his head and shed tears silently from an angle that others couldn't see. He remembered that when he went home to celebrate the new year with his grandfather during the winter vacation of his second year of college, he also said that he would take his grandfather to travel with him after graduation. He wondered if he had fulfilled his promise. The two of them have been dependent on each other for so many years, and Grandpa has left this world before he has time to enjoy himself. 2 black and white photos of the tombstone. Xia Venan's grandfather Beta has always stayed in his youth. The photo is a straight young man with thick eyebrows and big eyes, while his grandfather Omega's hair is all pale and the corners of his eyebrows are fine wrinkles, but his eyes are still clear. He is neither sad nor bitter, gentle and kind. Maybe he knows that someone is waiting for him, and one day they can meet. The 2 photos are close to each other, and they do not violate and do not violate. Xia Venan put his forehead lightly on the cold tombstone and said softly, "I'm sorry." Xia Venan stayed in front of Grandpa's tombstone for nearly half an hour, and when his tears were almost dry, he raised his head. He found that Ming Luchuan was no longer by his side at some point. He stood up and looked around, and saw Ming Luchuan standing at the end of a row of tombstones, looking into the distance. At this point, Xia Venan didn't feel that Ming Luchuan was such a difficult person to get along with. Ming Luchuan was wearing a suit and trousers, with a white shirt on the upper body, the collar of the shirt was open, the hem of the shirt was tucked into the waist of the trousers, the waist was thin and the legs were long, which was eye-catching. Xia Venan walked towards him. He should have noticed, but did not turn back. Until Xia Venan stopped beside him and said to him, "Can you wait for me a little longer?" Ming Luchuan turned to look at him. Xia Venan said, "I want to see my parents again." Ming Luchuan seemed to be stunned for a short time, and then said, "Okay." Xiaovenin seemed to wake up from the shock of his grandfather's death, and his thoughts gradually became clear. He went to buy a bunch of flowers for his parents and sent them to their graves, squatting down to accompany them talked for a while. His parents died very early, all his memories of them come from a photo album at home, and then when he came to the grave with his grandfather every year, he saw the black and white photos on the tombstone. For parents who have no memory, more emotional connection comes from the nature of attachment to their parents. Xiaovenin looked at the young men and women on the tombstone and suddenly realized that he really had no relatives in the future, so even more intense sadness surged up, and for a long time he couldn't utter a word. It was past 5 o'clock in the afternoon when I left the cemetery. Ming Luchuan went to the small supermarket to buy water. Xiaovenin stood beside the car, looking at the empty parking lot at a loss. A bottle of mineral water with a cold mist was handed to him. Xiaovenin took it subconsciously, saw Ming Luchuan holding another bottle of water, went around the front of the car, opened the driver's door and sat in. Xiaovenin looked at Ming Luchuan in a daze. Ming Luchuan lowered the car window, looked at him and asked, "Why don't you get in the car?" Xiaovenin asked in confusion, "Where should I go?" Ming Luchuan glanced around. Although the sky did not darken, there was almost no one else in the cemetery except the staff. He said, "Are you going to stay here for the night?" Xiaovenin followed his gaze and looked around and said, "That's not true." Ming Luchuan said, "Don't be afraid, your grandfather will protect you." Xiaovenin stretched out his hand and pressed it on the edge of the car window. "I don't want to cause trouble to his old man." Ming Luchuan said, "Then don't get in the car." The car slowly drove out of the cemetery. Xiaovenin felt a sense of uneasiness while sitting in the co-pilot. This unease was not obvious in the hospital before. When he saw his grandfather in the cemetery and confirmed that his grandfather had passed away, it became more and more uplifting. He asked Ming Luchuan, "Where are you going now?" Ming Luchuan asked him, "Where do you want to go?" Xiaovenin said, "I want to go home." Speaking of which, he asked worriedly, "Is my home still there?" Ming Luchuan was silent for a while and told him, "It's still there." Xiaovenin breathed a sigh of relief. Ming Luchuan drove away from the cemetery and drove towards the county town. On the road, a large truck rolled over, blocking half of the road and delaying more than half an hour. By the time the county town was almost dark. Xiaovenin and his grandfather lived in the old factory dormitory where his grandfather worked. The factory closed down many years ago, but the old house still remains. The car is parked in the surface parking lot outside the mall. Ming Luchuan is obviously familiar with the neighborhood, which makes Xiaovenin more uneasy, as if the more familiar Ming Luchuan is, the more likely their marriage relationship is real. They haven't had dinner yet. After Ming Luchuan got off the bus, he went straight to a fast food restaurant on the first floor of the mall. Xiaovenin stood there and looked at his back. After walking 5 or 6 meters, Ming Luchuan stopped and looked back at Xiaovenin, "Don't eat." Xiaovenin followed. The light in the fast food restaurant is bright, but there are not many customers. There are only 4 young girls sitting at a table in the corner, who look like high school students from the county middle school. Xiaovenin ordered a meal and sat face to face with Ming Luchuan. From his angle, he happened to see the girls turning their heads to look at them from time to time. Xiaovenin understood what they were looking at. Alphas like Ming Luchuan are not common in small towns, most of them are betas like him. The strong and excellent alpha has always been the first choice for omega and beta women to choose a mate, no matter where they are eye-catching. The 4 girls sitting in the corner are all beta, not very outstanding in appearance, but have the cuteness of young girls. One of the girls stood up, passed by them, glanced at Ming Luchuan with a look of indifference, and then walked to the order counter to buy an ice cream. While waiting, I kept looking this way until I bought the ice cream and went back to my seat next to them. Ming Luchuan didn't seem to notice those eyes at all, but Xiaovenin's eyes couldn't help chasing behind the girl, watching her sit down in the seat, lowered her head and covered her mouth to joke with the other three. Slender fingers stretched out in front of his eyes and tapped twice on the table to call his attention. Xia Wen looked at Ming Luchuan in the south, and Ming Luchuan asked coldly, "What are you looking at?" "It's nothing," Xia Venan denied. He heard the counter calling out their order number, so he simply got up and went to get their order. At the same time, he couldn't help but look back at the passing by girls beside them. Xia Venan didn't really see anything, he just felt strange. When the girl passed by them just now, he smelled the scent of omega pheromones. If he read it right, the girl should be a beta. Back with the plate, Xia Venan sat down to have dinner with Ming Luchuan. By this time, the intense emotions had faded, and Xia Venan began to feel tired and hungry. Life has been like a dream these few days, and it still doesn't seem to have come true. He lowered his head and gulps down a piece of fried rice with a spoon. Then he picked up the water glass and drank half a glass of lemonade. After putting down the glass, he looking at Ming Luchuan, he asked, "Where are you going?" Ming Luchuan just finished eating, he reached out and took out a tissue to wipe his lips lightly. Hearing this, he looked up at him, "Where do you think I should go?" Xia Venan didn't know what to say, so he took 2 more sips from the water glass and said, "My family's conditions are not very good." Ming Luchuan said, "I have been to your house." Xia Venan stopped talking. They came out of the fast food restaurant and walked to the old factory building where Xia Venan used to live. The building is indeed very old, but it is still full of residents. It's clean. I wondered how to stay at night if Minglu River did not leave. When he was standing at the door of the house, he suddenly came back to his senses and realized a serious problem. He looked at Ming Luchuan blankly and said, "I didn't bring the key." After Xia Venan said this, he kept looking at Ming Luchuan under the dim light, waiting for his response. In the end, Ming Luchuan asked, "Really?" After Xia Venan came out of the hospital, all he thought about was going home, and he felt like he used to be, whenever he came home, there was someone waiting for him, and only at this stage did he realize that there was nothing in him at all. Key. He didn't even know where the keys to the house were kept. Ming Luchuan looked at him silently, and asked, "What should I do now?" In the past, if you can't go home, you can go back to school, but can't you go back to school? Xia Venan's mind was empty, watching Ming Luchuan without speaking. Ming Luchuan suddenly turned and went downstairs. Xia Venan followed half a step subconsciously, then stopped, and saw Ming Luchuan go downstairs step by step, until his back disappeared at the corner of the stairs. He listened to the footsteps of Ming Luchuan who kept going downstairs in the empty corridor, and finally couldn't help leaning over to the gap between the handrails and asked, "Are you gone?" He felt that Ming Luchuan should not just leave, they seem to have a lot of unclear things that have not been resolved, but at this moment he couldn't figure it out, so he could only shout, "We haven't filed for divorce, have we? Should we divide the property?" Ming Luchuan's footsteps seemed to pause for 2 seconds, and then continued to walk. Xia Venan leaned his arm on the handrail of the stairs and was stunned for 2 or 3 minutes before hearing footsteps going upstairs. The sound of leather shoes stepping on the stairs. Xia Venan was clearly not familiar with Ming Luchuan, but he could tell that it was Ming Luchuan's footsteps. Sure enough, after a while, Ming Luchuan appeared at the corner of the stairs and slowly approached Xia Venan. Walking to the door, Ming Luchuan said nothing and opened the door with a key in his hand. Xia Venan asked him, "Where did you get the key?" Ming Luchuan replied, "You left it with the guard." At the same time, he reached out and turned on the living room light. As the lights came on, Xia Venan could no longer notice what Ming Luchuan said. He walked into the door and stood there for a long time without moving. Xia Venan slowly walked inside. On the right side of the living room is the kitchen and a small balcony, on the left side are 2 bedroom doors with a bathroom in between. One of the bedrooms belonged to Grandpa and the other belonged to Xia Venan. The door was closed but not locked. Xia Venan first opened the door of Grandfather's bedroom. The room was still filled with the old smell, but Xiaovenin seemed to be able to smell the smell that belonged to grandfather. It was Grandpa's pheromone. Grandpa was an Omega. Although Xiaovenin was not young when he had memories, he was petite and delicate like most Omegas, and his pheromones were sweet, like a lemon-flavored fruit candy. When she was a child, Xiaovenin liked to sit in Grandpa's arms and hug his waist, just like holding a soft and warm fruit candy. And now he can only sit down silently beside his grandfather's bed, trying to find the sweet smell of the air. Ming Luchuan originally followed behind him to the door of the room. Seeing him sit down beside the bed, he gently closed the door for him and exited. Xiaovenin bent down, lowered his head very low, rested his elbows on his knees, clasped his hands and lowered his forehead. Finally, he spread out his hands, rubbed his face in the palm of his hand, took a deep breath and stood up. He turned on the lights in the room brighter, rummaged through Grandpa's cabinets and drawers, and found that there was nothing left. Grandpa's old clothes were all disposed of. There used to be a small drawer in the wardrobe to store documents and valuables, but all of them have been lost. Xiaovenin came out of his grandfather's room, and when he passed the living room, he saw Ming Luchuan sitting alone on the sofa in the living room. He didn't have time to say hello, and hurried into his room. A slight difference there is that some of his old clothes and books are still left, but important documents are still missing. After a while, Xiaovenin came out of the room. He walked to the sofa and looked at Minglu River. Ming Luchuan did not stand up, only looked up at him slightly. "Didn't my grandfather leave me a penny?" Xiaovenin asked suspiciously. Ming Luchuan said, "There should be." Xiaovenin asked tentatively, "Where?" Ming Luchuan looked at him quietly for a while. "Do you suspect that I swallowed it for you?" "No, I'm not amnesia, I can't even ask." Ming Luchuan stood up from the edge of the sofa. Xiaovenin took a step back subconsciously to avoid getting too close to him. "You want to stay?" Ming Luchuan asked. "If you have to come back to live, I am afraid it will take some time to clean up, and at the same time you have to buy some daily necessities. The biggest problem now is that he has no money, he has to find his ID and bank card." "Let's go home," Xiaovenin said. Ming Luchuan was stunned for a moment, and asked him, "Which home?" Xiaovenin said hesitantly, "The house we live in together." Ming Luchuan looked at him silently. Xiaovenin was a little guilty for a moment, but he quickly thought about it. Why should he be guilty? He raised his chin to make himself appear confident and his voice hardened. "I still need to clean up the things in my house? Bank card documents and the like?" Ming Luchuan asked. "Go back now." Xiaovenin nodded, "I think so." Ming Luchuan said, "That's good." Turned around and walked outside. "Have you ever had one of my rings?" Under the dim light, Ming Luchuan raised his brows imperceptibly and asked, "What ring?" "It just means more to me." The ring belonged to his grandfather. He used to take it out, saying that it was an heirloom of the Xia family. This time back, Xiaovenin did not see the ring that Grandpa treasured. At this time, Ming Luchuan asked again, "What's the meaning?" Xiaovenin was reluctant to explain to him that much, and then said, "It's nothing, it's not worth much anyway." Ming Luchuan's face suddenly turned cold. He threw a sentence, "I haven't seen it before," turned around and walked towards the stairs. It was late at night when Ming Luchuan drove Xiaovenin back to the city. When Xiaovenin woke up in the hospital, what he was most concerned about was his grandfather's affairs. Now that the dust has settled, the thick tiredness has invaded the body that has not yet recovered. He sat in the co-pilot and fell asleep halfway through the car. When he woke up, Xiaovenin found that the car had stopped. He opened his eyes and saw a dimly lit parking lot outside the window glass, and Ming Luchuan was sitting next to him, looking at him. Ming Luchuan probably looked at him for a while, but Xiaovenin didn't look away when he opened his eyes, just asked, "Awake?" Xiaovenin rubbed his eyes. He stretched out his arms and looked out the window again. "Are you there yet?" Ming Luchuan did not answer, opened the door to get out of the car, and said, "Get off when you wake up." The spacious underground parking lot, although full of cars, still looks empty. Xiaovenin followed Ming Lichuan to the elevator. When he saw that most of the expensive luxury cars were in the garage, he felt dizzy and asked, "What do I do now?" When entering the elevator, Ming Lichuan replied, "I don't have a job, you take care of me at home." Xiaovenin yawned, with a lazy tone, "Do you believe what you said? Lu Chuan is not really that scary. My grandfather told me from a very young age that people must support themselves and not rely on others." Ming Lichuan stood upright, his back even more straight, and said, "So what?" Xiaovenin said, "I listened to my grandfather very much." When the elevator reached the floor, Xiaovenin followed Ming Lichuan out. When he saw the elevator came out, it was a small garden with only one door. Ming Lichuan opened the door with a fingerprint lock, lighting up the ceiling lights to illuminate a spacious and uncluttered living room. This is a house of nearly 200 square meters. The decoration style tends to be masculine and cold, and the color is mainly black and white. Xiaovenin walked to the floor-to-ceiling glass window of the living room and looked out, and saw a garden downstairs, with orange lights everywhere in the middle of the night. After Ming Lichuan returned home, he didn't tell him anything and went straight to the inner room. Xiaovenin looked around curiously, followed the voice, stood at the door of a bedroom, looked at Ming Lichuan who was taking off his shirt, and asked, "I used to live here?" Ming Lichuan took off his shirt, naked with his muscular upper body, and started to take off his trousers again. He didn't look at Xiaovenin, and said, "You live in the garden outside?" Xiaovenin rolled his eyes and saw that the double bed in the middle of the room was more than 2 meters wide with 2 pillows placed side by side. He had a bad feeling in his heart, but he still asked, "Which one is my room?" Ming Lichuan had already taken off his trousers and turned to face him, "This is your room." Xiaovenin lived nearly 20 years in his memory and got along well with many male classmates. It was common for them to play ball and swim and change clothes together. While most of these are betas, there is an occasional alpha or two. In the past, in his gender consciousness, he did not regard male alphas as the opposite sex, then he should not treat Ming Lichuan now if he hadn't known that they were married. Naturally at ease. For example now, Xiaovenin suddenly found out that the male alpha is really tall, his shoulders are wide, the muscles of his chest and abdomen are firm and distinct, and although his waist is thin, he looks very strong. And those legs should be much longer than their own. Xiaovenin is confident in her figure and appearance. He was born and raised in a small county, where 90% of the people in the county are beta, and only 10% are alpha and omega. These alphas and omegas are not necessarily good in their own gender groups, but they are still very beautiful in the beta, and Xiaovenin is also very beautiful in the beta. In her first year of high school, Xiaovenin received a confession from the only female omega in her grade. This was a sensational event in a high school in a small county, and even caused dissatisfaction among several alphas in the school. But now Xiaovenin thinks that Ming Lichuan's figure should be better than his. This is the natural advantage of the alpha gender. Ming Lichuan, who was only wearing underwear, stood in front of Xiaovenin very calmly. He saw Xiaovenin staring at him in a daze and asked, "What are you looking at?" Xiaovenin turned his eyes away, covered his discomfort with a calm tone, and said, "It's nothing." Ming Lichuan didn't speak any more, turned and walked to the bathroom of the bedroom. When the door of the bathroom was closed, Xiaovenin stood at the door and hesitated for a while. He went into the bedroom, opened the wardrobe in the room and looked through it, and found that only Ming Lichuan's clothes were in the wardrobe. He finally took it easy. Afterwards, Xiaovenin came out of the master bedroom and went around to the other 2 rooms, and found that one was a study, and the other was a secondary bedroom, which was smaller than the master bedroom, also equipped with a bathroom, and the bedroom bed. The bedding is complete, as well as a desk and a wardrobe. The desk has books and a laptop. When the wardrobe is opened, there are some unfamiliar clothes. The size is Xiaovenin's size. He walked to the desk, carefully looked at the row of books above, and found that many of them were his own professional books, and finally felt relieved. The desk has drawers, and the drawers are full of personal things, including a work permit of his own. The company that Xiaovenin works for is Minjian Fragrance Technology Co., Limited. On the work card, and the position is the manager of the product development department. Xiaovenin couldn't help but slightly opened his mouth, and after a while he put the work card on back in the drawer. He sat on the office chair and turned for half a circle, thinking that he could get a divorce as soon as possible. There are other things in the drawer, but Xiaovenin did not find his important documents, nor did he find his bank card and passbook, and he didn't know where he received his grandpa's ring. Xiaovenin rummaged through the room, and finally found a safe under the wardrobe. The safe was locked by a combination. He tried it with his birthday and the password was not correct, so he didn't dare to try again. Ming Luchuan had finished taking a bath, put on loose pajamas and sat beside the bed. A small lamp was lit in the room, and it seemed that he was going to sleep. Xiaovenin asked him, "Do you know the password of my safe?" Ming Luchuan looked up at him, his eyes cold. "Are you polite? Don't know how to knock?" Xiaovenin simply pushed the door completely open and walked in with a swagger. "Isn't it my room?" He walked all the way to the bed. Ming Luchuan didn't speak, just looked up at him. His eyes slowly moved with him, and finally stopped, stretched out his hand and pulled him onto the bed, and said in an emotionless tone, "Go to sleep." Xiaovenin threw himself on Ming Luchuan almost without warning. At that moment, he clearly smelled the pheromone of Ming Luchuan, so he relied on his sensitive and vigorous skills to lie on the bed. After rolling, he quickly moved away from Minglu River and stood up from the other side of the bed. He stood beside the bed, his heart was beating violently because of fright. He looked at Ming Luchuan and asked, "What are you doing?" Ming Luchuan lay on the bed without getting up, stretched out his hand and pulled the quilt to cover his chest. "Didn't you say go back to the room to sleep?" Xiaovenin said, "Don't lie to me, I obviously don't live in this room, we are separated, right?" Ming Luchuan did not answer this question. Xiaovenin suddenly thought, maybe strictly speaking, it should be called bed separation rather than separation, but now is not the time to struggle with this issue. He immediately asked again, "Do you know the password of my room safe?" Ming Luchuan glanced at him, "Is there a safe in your room?" Sichuan. He always firmly believed that he and Ming Luchuan were not a real husband and wife relationship, and Ming Luchuan did not match his sexual orientation from beginning to end. Xiaovenin intends to leave this room. Just 2 steps away, Ming Luchuan stopped him. "Wait." Xiaovenin turned around. Ming Luchuan said, "Help me turn off the lights." Back to his room, Xiaovenin rummaged through the cabinet to find the pajamas, went to the bathroom to take a shower, and then lay down on the bed with all 4 limbs stretched out on his back. He was very tired, although his mind was still very active, but the brain has obviously begun to protest, like a rusty gear, trying to turn it or making a rustling noise, which is inefficient. He thought that he had forgotten something, but he couldn't remember it for a while, so he gradually fell asleep under this thick tiredness. This sleep was probably not that heavy. Xiaovenin recalled that he felt that he had been dreaming all night, and the dream was bizarre. He only remembered a particularly impressive part. He returned to his grandfather in the house where we lived together. I went into the room to see my grandfather, but my grandfather became Ming Luchuan. He felt that something was wrong, and he couldn't say what was wrong, and then the dream gradually blurred. When she woke up the next morning, Xiaovenin felt dizzy. He slept on his side and maintained his original position for a while before opening his eyes and turning over. The moment he turned over, Xiaovenin was sobered up because he saw a tall figure beside the bed. It was Ming Luchuan. Ming Luchuan was wearing a shirt and trousers, the neckline was slightly open, and the hair was combed up to reveal his forehead. Although he didn't wear a tie, he looked like he was about to go out. Xiaovenin didn't know when he came in, but it looked like he had been standing beside the bed for a long time, and his eyes kept falling on Xiaovenin's face. Now that Xiaovenin woke up, Ming Luchuan was still calm, so he calmly asked, "Awake?" Xia Venan recovered from the shock, subconsciously pulled the quilt up a little, and asked, "Why are you here?" Ming Luchuan didn't answer him, only said, "I'm going to work." This reminded Xia Venan of one thing. He recalled the work permit he found last night, and asked Ming Luchuan, "I have a job? Did I ask for leave from a car accident?" Ming Luchuan said, "I asked for you." "How long?" Ming Luchuan lowered his head and buttoned the cuff buttons of his shirt, saying, "Please wait until you are healed and can go back to work." Xia Venan was a little stunned. "Can I ask for that long? Is my boss so talkative?" Ming Luchuan glanced at him, didn't answer the question, just said, "I'm leaving." "Are you going to stay at home or go to the company with me today?" "Why should I go to the company with you?" Xia Venan was a little puzzled. Ming Luchuan said, "That's up to you." After speaking, he walked towards the door. "Wait!" Xia Venan stopped him. He wanted to lift the quilt and get out of bed, but realized that he was wearing only a pair of underwear when he slept, so he hurried back and asked Ming Luchuan, "Where are my ID and bank card?" Ming Luchuan said, "I don't know." "Impossible." Xia Venan had already figured it out. "Then what happened when I was discharged from the hospital yesterday? Besides, I broke my phone in a car accident, so my card and ID wouldn't be broken, right?" Ming Luchuan turned his gaze back and walked straight out. Xia Venan was in a hurry. He didn't care that he was not wearing clothes. He hurriedly lifted the quilt and got out of bed. He ran after him barefoot, grabbed Ming Luchuan's arm. "Don't go, give your things first." Ming Luchuan stopped and turned to look at him from head to toe. In order to hide her guilty conscience, Xia Venan raised her chest on purpose and said, "What are you looking at? Haven't seen the handsome guy?" Ming Luchuan's eyes slowly moved to the hand he was holding, and he said coldly, "Let go." Xia Venan felt that he should insist, "Return the ID card to me." He had already thought about it. If Ming Luchuan insisted on not giving it to him, he told Ming Luchuan that he would call the police. In the end, Ming Luchuan said, "How can I get it for you if you don't let go?" Xia Venan was stunned. Ming Luchuan raised his hand and held Xia Venan's hand that grabbed his arm. Xia Venan immediately retracted his hand. Ming Luchuan then walked towards his room. After a while, he took out a wallet and threw it to Xia Venan. Xia Venan received it in his hand, and quickly opened his wallet to see, and saw that there was his ID card, a few bank cards in the driver's seat, and a membership card of an unknown mall. Next, Ming Luchuan handed him a mobile phone. Although the mobile phone has no outer packaging, it is obviously new, and there is still a layer of sealing film on it. Xia Venan didn't take it immediately. He looked at Ming Luchuan. Ming Luchuan said, "I asked Su Feng to buy it yesterday, and your old card has already been loaded." "Thank you," Xia Venan responded subconsciously, reached out to take the phone, and asked, "Why didn't you give it to me yesterday?" Ming Luchuan did not speak. Xia Venan anxiously turned on. The mobile phone is a new model on the market. Xia Venan has never used it and is not familiar with the brand, but there is probably no problem with the operation. He quickly turned on the phone and rummaged through the contents, but found that except for the communication, everything else was empty. He raised his head to find Ming Luchuan, only to notice that Ming Luchuan had already tied his tie and walked to the door of the room with his coat, looking like he was about to go out. "Hey!" Xia Venan called him quickly. Ming Luchuan did not intend to stop. Xia Venan chased after him, raised his hand and pressed it on Ming Luchuan's shoulder. "Didn't you hear me calling you?" Ming Luchuan turned his head and said coldly, "My name is Et." Xia Venan had to say, "Sorry, brother." Ming Luchuan turned around and opened the door and walked out. Xia Venan reached out and pulled him again. "Wait a minute, Ming Luchuan." Ming Luchuan stopped and looked back at him. "When did you get into the habit of streaking?" Xia Venan glanced down at himself, and Ming Luchuan looked at him for so long anyway, he didn't care anymore, and hurriedly asked the question he wanted to ask. I can get my phone back to the original one. Messages? Photos and text messages. Mingluchuan said, no. After speaking, he raised his hand and closed the door. Xiaovenan hurriedly blocked, well, the last question, can you give me the key here? Mingluchuan didn't answer, but suddenly grabbed his hand and pulled him outside. Xiaovenan subconsciously resisted, what are you doing? I'm not wearing clothes. On the contact surface, I heard a click of the door lock, and the display screen prompted to unlock it, and then I suddenly realized that I could directly open the fingerprint lock here. Mingluchuan dropped his hand and walked towards the elevator door.